Okay, so on the Vatican film list in the category of religion, Luis Buñuel's 1959 film Nazarene. Buñuel was a Spanish filmmaker working in Mexico at the time, so this is a Mexican production. And it's an interesting inclusion on the Vatican film list because Buñuel was known as kind of an apostate, anti-Catholic filmmaker in many of his films, and this one is no exception in that it is a critique of the value of the religious life. Nazarene is about a priest, Father Nazario, who is basically he's kind of like the ideal priest in a way. He's very. I describe him as a totally by the book priest, by the book modern priest. You know, he's not superstitious. He's not overly rationalistic. He goes straight down the middle. He's lives a life of asceticism and renunciation. He serves the poor. He, allows people to steal from him and beat him and turns the other cheek. And the film kind of shows his misadventures with
two women in particular who kind of end up becoming his followers, his disciples, sort of.
Two prostitutes who are the only people who want anything to do with him, essentially, in the film. And the film kind of questions whether he actually does any good in the end, regardless of the fact that on paper he is, an example of religion doing what it claims to, being what it claims to be. So Maria Elena, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the background of this filmmaker, because I have never seen any of his other works before.
It's an interesting question. The first thing to understand is that Buñuel was Spanish, born in 1900 in Aragon, in the center east of Spain, a very harsh land, the land of Goya, the land of artists that have sometimes a depiction of Spain as we would call La España Negra, dark Spain, black Spain. Buñuel belonged to a family that was well-to-do, that were landowners, lived in the countryside, and then moved when he was 7 or 8 to Zaragoza. He attended Catholic schools, 8 years with the Jesuits, and that shaped his world. At age 18, 19, he moves from Zaragoza, conservative, steeped in the post-Tridentine church, so to speak. He moves to Madrid. We're talking the 1920s, the center of fervor, intellectual enthusiasm, and the idea that Spain had to become modern. So there's a huge shock between his provincial background, conservative, traditionally Catholic, and this world that he sees in Madrid. He studies engineering for a while. He becomes, by 1924, he has a degree in history, and he moves to Paris, at the time, and still today, in many ways, the center of intellectual effervescence. There, he becomes or toys with Dadaist ideas and with surrealism. And his first two films are emblematic of this artistic experimentation. And he makes them in the company of Salvador Dalí, his buddy from Madrid and in Paris. He makes them as sort of torches against his background.
Yeah, the only film of Buñuel's that I had seen before watching this one was Un Chien Andalou, and I really didn't know anything about him at that point, and I really didn't learn anything about him since. So he's kind of been this enigmatic figure in my mind. So it was very interesting for me to watch this movie knowing nothing else about him except that film, that short film, which at the time that I had watched it, this was in art school, and my professor had done nothing to prepare us for this. So I went into it completely unknowing, and it's quite shocking, to say the
It is.
least.
If you want to think of the career of Luis Buñuel, it begins with that eye slit by a razor in Ancien Andalou, 1928, and his last film, I'll tell you the title of his last film in a minute. The last image of that film is the brigade of the infant Jesus setting up a bomb in a Paris mall. The Phantom of Liberty. No, it's not the Phantom of Liberty. I'll tell you the name in a minute. So his whole career is bracketed by a desire to shock, by his roots in surrealism, psychoanalysis, all these experiences that he saw and lived in the 1920s, and deeply shaped by his family social background. So Ancien Andalou, it's an attempt to put dreams on the screen. So it's the anti-Hollywood classic narrative. Mm-hmm. It's a succession of images that end up telling a story that has no characters and has no plot. But what it has is a brutal critique of what Buñuel and the surrealists and Dadaists consider stifle the individual. The institutions of the society, marriage, the family, the military, the aristocracy, wealth. So his films always have been a protest against, in quotes, the establishment. We should make a distinction, though, between calling Buñuel anti-Catholic and anti-clerical. In many ways, and I think you can see this in the films, Buñuel never left the church per se, even though he proclaimed himself an atheist. Buñuel is anti-clerical. Buñuel considers himself an atheist, thanks God. And even the last line in the film Nazarene is, he hesitates at first to receive the pineapple from the humble woman who wants to help him. And he says in Spanish, Dios se lo pague. God pays you for this mercy. So he is the one that wrestles against God, right? So he's not anti-Catholic, anti-Christian. He is in the fold in a super peculiar way.
I think you can kind of see that in this film because, well, I mean, first off, it ends up getting onto the Vatican film list, right? So clearly this film isn't so unambiguously anti-Catholic that it couldn't be celebrated by, this Vatican commission. There's clearly something there, and yet the anti-clerical component is also quite obvious because there is a stinging critique. Now, I guess for me the question is where that balance is. Is it really so? Does it end up in the final analysis really being so sympathetic to religion?
The first question to be addressed in many ways is the inclusion of the film in the 15 titles important for the religious values. It's interesting to notice too that Robert Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest of the 1950s doesn't make the list, and it's a very similar film. But ultimately is the reaffirmation of the mystery of grace, right? So it is that final line of Diary of a Country Priest, tout est grâce, everything is grace.
Right.
In the end of Nazarene, what we have is the moving out of the transcendent, the religious, the spiritual sphere into the human side of things.
This is, I totally agree with you. It's ultimately a humanistic film.
Exactly right. But the emphasis is not on the humanistic side. The emphasis is in this rage against Catholicism, or the Catholicism of Buñuel's era, the way he learned it. It's the Catholicism of a God of sort of an Old Testament, very rational, meting out justice and this and that. Mm-hmm. And that's the rebellion of Buñuel. So in other films of this religious connotation, like Simón del Desierto, Simon of the Desert, and Viridiana, we have a similar pattern. It's the abandonment of the Catholic reference mindset, jettisoning it at the end as a result of a crisis, and then going with the human. But the human is almost like an afterthought. It's not what it set out to be. These films are, the Buñuel films dealing with the Catholic faith, deal with, by exclusion, the problem of evil. Evil, if not, it's not a mystery. Evil, it's a given, it's there. Life is hell. And also with the problem of the transcendent, the communication with God. And it's not that God is silent, like in the Northern European filmmakers, is that God is mean, that God gives us a veil by which we are all alienated from the reality. It's a horrific view, but it's within the confines of the tribe, so to speak.